Hello, and welcome to the Atlanta Opera Das Rheingold Limited Series, where we explore topics around Richard Wagner's Das Rheingold and the Ring Cycle. I'm your host, Cara Consilvio. On today's episode, I will be speaking with production designer Erhard Rom about his work as a designer and his process in creating the scenic and projections design for the Atlanta Opera production of Das Rheingold. Hello, Erhard Rom. Thank you so much for joining me today on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I would love to start a little bit further back than this production that's happening at the Atlanta Opera, the Das Rheingold. When did you get introduced to theater or opera? Was there some sort of experience in your childhood that was seminal in bringing you into this world?
Definitely. When I was 8 years old, my parents took me to theater, local sort of community theater, a children's theater in the neighborhood. And I saw some plays. Among them was Pinocchio, I remember. And I came home and I started making little replicas of the set I saw. And I remember that my parents were sort of surprised by that. I remember my mom, who had gone with us to see the productions, said that it looked very much like what was actually on the stage. And I think that sort of surprised them. I also started taking piano, and I was really into music and the theater and drawing and painting and art. And that interest led my parents to making a decision to take me to see a production of the opera Fidelio, because of the combination of music and theater. And my dad was really into opera. And so that production of Fidelio really changed my life. I remember going there and just being blown away by the whole thing.
And where was that production?
That was in Seattle. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and so it was Seattle Opera. And it was also, I think, significant that it was sung in English. I mean, my parents had the recordings, and we heard, opera was playing and classical music was playing, jazz as well, but mostly classical music. And we heard symphonies and piano music and Bach cantatas and opera and even Wagner. Although I remember as a kid, I didn't like the Wagner. I thought it just sounded like a lot of chattering, except for some great orchestral moments. And it took longer for me to appreciate that. But Beethoven was, exciting, the Fidelio. But the English, I think it's really important because I was so excited to go and see these live performers and singing in a language you could understand. And so that really, I think, was a huge impact. And then just all the, they had art books and philosophy books and literature around the house. All that kind of led to me getting interested in all that stuff.
And how old were you when you saw that Fidelio?
8.
Wow.
I was 8. And
That's
then we
amazing.
started to go regularly to see operas and plays in Seattle. And the opera was we eventually would go to, we always went to see it in English. And we sat very close so you could actually hear all the words. That was just a huge impact. And then I in addition to making these little miniature models of productions, which I think sometimes designing is sort of a strange thing. Like, why do people choose to do that? I don't think I chose it. It just chose me in a funny way. But I started to do sort of miniature productions as a kid, and
did you bring other people into these miniature productions, or were they sort of your own one-person work of art?
My brother and sister sometimes participated somewhat, but it was mostly me doing my thing. And I made a little miniature stage out of plywood and painted it, and then I would make figures out of clay and make sets and put that all in this box. And I would take lamps, desk lamps, and find pieces of toys or plastic that had color in them and put it over the light so that it would be blue or red light.
That's amazing. Do you have it? Did you ever take any photos of these? Do you have an archive?
Well, actually, because what happened is I was doing that at 8, 9, and then I asked for Christmas. I asked my parents if they could get me a stage. I said, I want a stage. So they had my piano teacher, who was also a carpenter and a harpsichord builder, Frank, actually, did a stage, built a little model stage for me. And then I
Wow.
started doing regularly, making these little productions. And by the time I was a teenager, I started to get more interested in Wagner, actually, because Seattle was a big Wagner place. So they were doing that. And then I started to learn the pieces. I started to realize how great they were. And I actually did a miniature, it's crazy. I mean, but I actually did a miniature production of the entire ring. And
Oh my God.
I would
That's amazing.
I would do, like, there would be little figures and wires and strings, and there was lighting and scenery. It was like I put the recording on. So there was a whole, deranged thing going on as a child.
So you were preparing for the ring pretty much your whole life, getting ready
So
for
yeah,
this scale.
that's what happened, and that was, was the whole early thing in my childhood of obsession with the music and the theater and particularly with design and so
And
forth.
and you mentioned studying piano, and you ended up going to school for your undergrad for music. And how did you come to that decision, and what was that experience like for you?
That's interesting. That question is something that I think about a lot because I don't really quite know why I did that. I love music, so I still do. It's a huge part of me, but it's never really been an end in itself for me. Though like I said, I studied piano. I learned to play. I still play the piano, and I did in college. I think it was interesting that before I got to college, I was in high school taking art classes, and that was really something I enjoyed. And people always thought, "Oh, you're going to do something with visual art." And then I wanted to do, because I was so interested in scenic design, I thought, well, the theater, they were doing musical or play at the high school, and I talked to the drama teacher, and she was going to have me do the set, but unfortunately, she didn't really want me to design the set. She wanted me to build the set. And I really do believe that I was turned off because I wanted to design things. I didn't really want to engineer and build them. And I think, and also when I got to college and I had this enthusiasm for music, that felt like I took classes in various things, and I felt like that was very welcoming. Um, in terms of art. So I was really interested in the music, the art of music, and that was a place I could explore. And I did take a couple classes here and there, not many. And again, I felt at the undergraduate level that theater theater design was always taught. I mean, in this country, it's really that way, more of a sort of hammer and wrench rather than paintbrush and pencil. And I really
Mm.
wanted to work with a paintbrush and pencil. And so I was always kind of like wavering, but I had all this work. And as you asked, are there photographs of this? Well, the ring, there are. I have pictures of that, and they were saved for years. And I would sometimes, in the middle of my studies at the music school in University of Washington, I would show friends and pictures, and they would always think, wait a minute, why aren't you doing this? This is crazy. Why aren't you? And I had that issue. So I studied music. I studied composition. I continued piano. I even did some performing. I actually performed the role of Papageno
Oh,
in the
wow.
college production of Magic Flute. Um, and so I had that experience of being on the performance side of it. And I never liked that, by the way. I always felt terrified by performance. And but I had this feeling that I was not really, there was this talent that I had innately there that was just being left dormant. And where was this music thing going? I was
Mm.
thinking about being maybe a music history teacher or something like that. And so I did study a lot of music history and um, opera history and so forth. All of that was very beneficial, but I needed to I realized that I really had to go down this other path and
Yeah.
pursue design.
And it's funny because, it might be seen as sort of a break or a detour, but all of that you studied must be so influential in what you do now and what you've been doing. Certainly for opera, having a deep understanding of music is such an advantage
And
to what you do.
yes, and I mean, I think that I really do feel that that's true. But the path of making that shift was actually kind of um, it was difficult, like I said, to make the choice to like start off and then say, I'm going to go pursue something entirely of another. I mean, because music and theater are totally related in my mind, but that it wasn't my background. Wasn't I didn't have the credit. So how do you go get an MFA? Well, I mean, in design, well, I had all this work that I'd done, but the real thing was my sister is a singer as well. And she sings in the chorus at San Francisco Opera. But at the time, she was in a program in Banff, Canada,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of doing an internship. And Colin Graham, who was, I'm sure many people know of one of the great British opera directors of the latter half of the 20th century, worked with Benjamin Britten. He worked at the Met, all over the place. He's no longer around, but he was running that program in Banff, Canada. And I had decided that I really wanted to think about pursuing design at that point, and my sister was there, and so we went to go see the performance that she was doing. And I met through Colin Graham's assistant. I met Colin Graham, and I actually had pictures of these. So your question about where,
Yeah.
I actually had those pictures and shared them with Colin Graham, and he was very positive and thought, well, you should be a designer. And he was extremely helpful, though he wanted to know, what would I do now? I mean, this was like stuff I did as a kid. So what would I do now was his question. So I went home and designed a project of Wozzeck for him. And I designed a couple other things, Carmen and Rosenkavalier, just projects of, doing the whole storyboard, and sent them to him to show him what I would do. And then that led him to introduce me to various people in the field of opera design. And one of them was John Conklin. And that was a huge, huge thing for me, because when I contacted Conklin, it turned out he was coming to Seattle to design a production of Trovatore with Nick Muny, a director who I later worked with, actually. And so when John Conklin was in Seattle, I arranged to meet with him, and we went and had lunch, and I went to dress rehearsals. I was just completely blown away by the breadth of his knowledge and experience, and all of his insights. It was just amazing conversation, and I thought, well, I must study with this person. And so I had already decided to go get an MFA and start an MFA at University of Washington, and that had Bob Dahlstrom was teaching scenic design there. So I had my first year, which was that year I met Conklin. Actually, I studied at University of Washington, but then in the middle of the year, I called up Conklin and said, I really would love to come to NYU. So so I finished my last 2 years of the MFA at NYU studying with Conklin. So that's how that all went from music to then design.
That's an amazing path, and John Conklin has been so influential on so many designers. It's
Yes.
amazing that he was able to sort of bring you in further into opera, and how was that time at NYU? Just completely immersed in design.
It was, I mean, I found that for me, it was absolutely thrilling, because not only was it a huge step um, in terms of what I was getting from the program, but just being suddenly moving from Seattle to New York City was a huge change, life changing thing. And there was so much there that I had not had available in Seattle. So I was just thrilled, and it was incredibly helpful. And then I later I did some work with Eugene Lee, and I assisted Conklin for quite a number of, at least 2 years, I think, off and on after I graduated. And that was working in his studio was also just absolutely fantastic. So,
And then, it's amazing that seems like you've always been really drawn to opera. What do you love about designing specifically for opera?
well, I mean, I think that the idea of having a story, text, poetry, um, theater combined with music is sort of like, to me, it feels like, well, combined not only with music and story, but also with visual art and dance, even. Um, that combination of all the arts coming together is just sort of the most incredible. Seems like one of the most incredible ideas humans have ever had. It just seems like when it really is good, I don't think there's anything better almost. When it's bad, it's pretty like there's nothing worse, but that's, you know, that's the trade-off. But when it works, it's really like nothing like it, because I think that music is able to pick up where words leave, where words can no longer express, the music expresses. And I just feel that that allows the sort of more poetic kind of storytelling to happen. I mean, opera by definition is really abstract because people are singing, so it feels like you're in a land of poetry. You're combining all the arts, and I'm always interested in design that is more poetic, an abstraction of reality rather than just a literal depiction. I mean, I don't think, I mean, I did some of this kind of work of realistic interiors for theaters. And I mean, if I were doing like sets for sitcoms or something, that would be, I'm sure there's, things you can find rewarding in that, but I'm more interested in sort of design that goes more in a kind of an abstracted, poetic direction. And opera by definition is sort of automatically goes there because of the fact that you're combining music and words in a way that is not what you see in day-to-day life. So
I would love to hear a little bit about your process. You've got a contract. Maybe it's a new opera that you haven't designed before, or one that you're revisiting after a long time away. Where do you start, and how do you navigate your process?
yeah, for me, the most important thing is always immersing oneself in the material. I mean, I actually really believe that the best work comes out of projects where I have committed as much of the piece to almost memory as possible, so that you really know it intimately, everything about that piece, so that you can recall it. You could see the whole piece in your mind as a whole, and rather than leafing through a script and trying to figure out where you are, if you really know it, it allows you to think about the design and how it will all come together and move through time. Because even though you're designing a set and it seems like a static thing, it actually isn't. It actually moves through the show. And of course, when I do projections as well, that even is more of a moving element. But the idea that you think about the complete piece as a whole, that's the starting point for me, is really knowing it backwards and forwards. And then what would follow from being well versed in the piece, and obviously doing research on the history of the piece and everything, um, there's a meeting with the director. And I almost never would come to a first meeting with a director to share visual images of any kind. I don't formulate an idea about anything at that point. I just want to know the piece backwards and forwards, and then come to a discussion with the director where we share ideas and have a conversation that leads us through kind of a nuanced and detailed discussion towards what possible interpretations we might want to pursue. And once there's some ideas or sense of possible directorial visions that are formulating in that conversation, then for a following meeting, I might come with actual visual imagery. And the visual imagery for me is, it's not just looking up a period of style, it's more about inspiration material. So while the period and the style are obviously part of that, the real goal of sharing imagery and research with the director and the creative team is to inspire a kind of possible direction for a visual language that can shape the whole production. And I also do it with the hope that it will lead us to together as a team towards what sort of visual ideas we're interested to pursue. So there may be things that I would share that don't appeal to the team, and so they go kind of away. But that's an important part, I think, is discovering where we can kind of connect. And you have to kind of have things, it gives you stuff to think about and talk about that to connect you with the visual possibilities of the piece. And once that starts to form a path, I take that inspiration material and I start to come up with rough sketches. I call also sketch models is something I call another phase. It's like in between a sketch and a model. It's sort of a model, but it's also rough. And then that, of course, leads um, to more detailed work. But I think in that early phase, when you're sharing things with the creative team together, to me, it's really important that it feels that people don't feel threatened
Hmm.
at that phase, that everybody's kind of coming together at an equal place, and that um, that you challenge each other. It's like a playground where you actually do challenge each other, and I feel like we need to not be threatened by those challenges. And in some ways, it's like letting go of control. It feels like it's like the best ideas in the conversation and in that dialogue, I think, should rise to the top because they stand up to all of that sort of discussion and make sense, and you follow through. If ideas don't sort of make sense and don't follow through, they have to kind of go away. And it's again, it's not about taking control or anybody assuming control. It's about letting go so that that everybody can kind of equally come to a place where they're not um, sort of steering things, but allowing things to kind of form together. To me, that's really important part of the process, and Tomer and I work together in that way all the time, and it's a really positive, I think, and productive way of working.
Yeah, I would love to talk specifically about working with Tomer, which we'll get to in a minute. But you mentioned, a lot of your designs include projections and video. How do you know when a show is calling for that, is speaking to you with a need for video?
That's a great question, and something that people often wonder about, I think, or ask that question. I think that the key with projection design, there's kind of two things about that need to be sort of addressed. One is that you can use a projector, as almost a very expensive and advanced lighting instrument. It can be used in a way that doesn't really necessarily look like projected imagery. The audience may not even be aware that it is projection they're seeing. That is something that I think is not really anything other than it's another lighting instrument. But then there's the world where you project imagery and the audience is aware of this imagery, and the question is, when would you want to bring that into to the vocabulary of the piece? And I think that it needs to come from a dramaturgical need rather than just replace. It has to be something that you can't do any other way. I mean, if you're just putting up a backdrop and you could have painted it, it's, to me, that's not as a great a use of a projection equipment. On the other hand, if it's a backdrop that's animated, well, you can't do that with a painted backdrop. So suddenly there's a need to have projection be a part of it because it's actually important that it have movement. I mean, it could be as simple as it's clouds or it's a lightning bolt or it's things that you want to be able to show. So for me, that's when projections start to become justified. But there's also the dramaturgical need. Like, I think that projections work like lighting. They're very closely related to music. So in opera, it's often not that hard, big a stretch to think of projections being a part of the language because it ties in so well with the music and the orchestra, particularly in like Wagner, where the orchestra is telling so much of the story.
I'd love to talk specifically about the Das Rheingold production for the Atlanta Opera and your collaboration with Tomer. How did you two begin to talk about the piece and find this beautiful visual world?
Well, it's interesting because Tomer and I had sort of hoped to do, ever since we did Semele in Seattle, Handel's opera Semele, we had been sort of talking about hoping to do a ring. And when he came to me and said that he was actually going to follow through with it, I wasn't sure if he was just kidding at first, and then I realized he was serious. And you know, we we knew that we were going to do Rheingold and Valkyrie, but we had still, and I think we will be doing Siegfried and Götterdämmerung, but it was something that we had planned with the hope that we would do all four. Now, the problem, of course, is that when you do the ring, if you do Rheingold and Valkyrie, you have to think about what Siegfried and Götterdämmerung will be. So really designing it is doing 4 operas. When you're designing the first one, you have to think about all 4. So we definitely from the start had to think that way. And the thing is that we met and talked about ideas from early on. I mean, I don't even remember the first conversations, but I know that what Tomer was very committed to and strongly believes in, that it didn't want to be set in a very specific time and place. He wanted mythology to be part of this language, and so we have definitely pursued that idea. That said, there also were images of an artist that I've been obsessed with for a long time named Anselm Kiefer, and I shared all those pictures with Tomer, and he was interested in that as well. That is an artist whose work is very post-World War II German artist. It's sort of layers of history, lots of texture in the paint, and it definitely feels like it comes from an industrial world. So we definitely took those ideas and put them into a mythological context, which of course that artist does as well. So it's not that it doesn't. It feels in our mind, we decided to call it a modern mythological landscape is what we've tried to create out of this. So you still feel that you're aware of the modern world, but at the same time, it's definitely not real. It's a mythic kind of landscape. We reference skyscrapers, we reference cranes and industrial machinery and so forth. So there's a sense of that, which I think, by the way, is related to sort of the overall ideas. I mean, our ideas about what the piece is ultimately about are always evolving, and I think everybody's ideas about. I mean, this piece is so incredibly deep and rich that there's sort of no way to kind of narrow it down to like this is what it's about in one sentence. But I mean, we definitely felt that it was a piece about sort of human flaw of wanting power and the greed and sort of lust for power, and how damaging that is and destructive in the end to the planet, and hoping to gain control of the planet, and wanting, which is what Albrecht and Wotan and everybody wants to achieve. And then the realization that it's only sort of a kind of a temporary thing that will vanish and ultimately lead to their destruction. And then I think that in addition to that sort of ruining destruction of the planet is the idea in Wagner's great message, and it's sort of theme that runs through all of his operas really, is the idea of that redemption through love, which is what is achieved at the end of Götterdämmerung. But I think that it's important because Tomer and I had a lot of conversations about the various definitions of love, and one of them that I think would be considered sort of the highest level of love would be I mean, in Wagner's mind and so forth, is the idea of a word Mitleid in German, which is to pity with, or to feel sympathy, or to feel empathy. And so in Parsifal, for example, that line is sung over and over again. The idea that through empathy that we become wise. And I think that that's the story that Wagner does so amazingly with The Ring, is that at the end, it's love or empathy or compassion that will give us the possibility of sort of redemption and salvation. So, and that theme again is in Parsifal in a big way. So that's was sort of the core idea. So we wanted to keep this mythological world, but let us relate some of that mythology to the world today in a kind of abstract way. I mean, one has to consider that when people created these stories that have been passed on for generations, and Wagner then did his own version, they were contemporary stories for the people that were making them. So we're making it not feel like it's set today, but it's not, you know, in a completely fantasized world as well.
And the projections play such a beautiful role integrated into the scenery. Did you always, was it from the very start that you had felt that dramaturgical need?
Oh, absolutely. Because again, I think that in Wagner, you know, it's like Greek drama. The orchestra is like the chorus. It tells so much of what's going on. And I feel that the projections can really work with the orchestra. I mean, my hope is that, I'm following what the music is saying down to the smallest details. There's all of the thematic ideas that Wagner created. And so I'm following all of those ideas to try to use projection to almost complement what the orchestra is doing and what the music is doing all through the piece. And so that was very important to us from the start. And we have 3 surfaces in this production that we're projecting onto. There's the huge LED wall in the rear, and there's the string curtain in the middle of the stage, and then there's the downstage scrim for interludes and so forth. So it's going to be a through line that is really a major part of the storytelling, will be this whole video design that we're doing. And I really am excited about it because, again, it's taking the music and responding to the music throughout the whole piece and tying it all together visually.
I love your story about making the entire production of The Ring when you were a kid. And, this might be some kid's first experience of The Ring at Das Rheingold. What kind of experience do you hope for the audience?
Well, I mean, I think that, what I couldn't do as a kid is is with little, productions, and even what people couldn't do then, with production. Projection was very limited at that time. You couldn't really create all these things that Wagner asked for. I mean, in a way, I feel like I thought as a child even that if you could make a movie of The Ring, wouldn't that be the most incredible thing? And we're not making a movie, but we are bringing things that cinematic ideas through video design to the stage in a way that I think is thrilling for me to be working on that. And it allows us to do things that were impossible. I mean, Wagner, in his day when he did The Ring, after the performances in 1876 or whatever, he was like in despair and said, I've invented the invisible orchestra, and now I need to invent the invisible stage. So ironically, of course, recording was that. But I think that he would have been thrilled with what you can do now with that cinematic technology. So I feel like we're doing that, but we have live performers, which makes it all the more thrilling. There's really, that orchestra is really there. Those singers are really there performing in front of you. And yet we can add this layer of the cinema, what cinematic video ideas can bring to the equation. So I hope that they feel, swept away and pulled into the music in a very compelling way.
Thank you for listening to the Atlanta Opera Das Rheingold Limited Series. Please follow us at the Atlanta Opera to stay up to date on our latest productions and events, and check out atlantaopera.org for more information. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. It's a great way for more people like you to find out about our content. And don't forget to follow the Atlanta Opera Podcast for more great episodes.